Good morning and welcome to this next installation of Public Education Week. I'm Nahliah Weber, the Executive Director of the Orleans Public Education Network, where we work with community to keep them informed and engaged around topics around public education, equity, and excellence in our public schools to galvanize the public to stay involved and fight for equity and justice for our students. Joining us on this new webinar that I'm really excited about is Chantelle Pierre, who's going to be speaking with us about new ways of thinking about and imagining better assessments for our children in our schools. So Chantelle, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself, and we're going to get started.
Thank you, Nahliah. So welcome everybody to this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about pushing for more equitable ways to assess our children in our schools. And I'm your presenter, Chantelle Pierre. And just a little bit about me. I have spent over 2 decades in education in various capacities. And this is important as we get into our discussion, just the context and where I'm coming from, the reasons why I decided to choose this topic. I started off in college and university admissions at Loyola and Tulane, and very randomly yet wonderfully at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. And then I've shifted my focus to doing nonprofit work, first as Dean of Students and then as Executive Director at Breakthrough New Orleans at Newman, which many of us know as Summerbridge. And then I went into admissions again at Wildwood School in Los Angeles as a director of K through 12 admissions. And so I did admissions from kindergarten all the way up and through. I had 2 campuses that I managed. It was a wonderful experience, and it helped shape a lot of what we're going to talk about today. Once I moved back home to New Orleans, I did a lot of work around fundraising and development with a charter management organization, Crescent City Schools, but then at a couple of private schools in the city as well. I'm currently the CEO of my consulting practice, HHP Consulting, where I focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion work for larger organizations, education-based organizations. And then I also provide fundraising support for small nonprofits. I like to say that I help tiny nonprofits get mighty through fundraising.
I love it.
Personally, I am the parent of 2 public school students. I have a son who is, he's in 6th grade. He's 12 years old. And then I have a daughter who is in 1st grade. And I'm from New Orleans. My childhood home was in Holly Grove, and we reside in Holly Grove right now. And we love the community. And I feel blessed that I'm able to raise my children in the same neighborhood, going to the same parks that I went to as a child. And so my experience as a parent and also my professional experience, it's really put me in a situation to where, especially my professional experience, where I've been a gatekeeper. While I have some classroom experience teaching, most of my experience has been evaluating the readiness of students from all walks of life for selective school experiences. And so again, this presentation is a culmination of what I know based on my experience as a gatekeeper, and then also what research validates to be true in terms of education and what's more worthy of our attention than standardized testing. So again, thank you for joining the webinar. So what's the problem with standardized testing? The nature or the point, the nature of standardized testing isn't problematic. Standardized testing can do a great job serving as a pulse check for student performance. It gives teachers, it gives school leaders, it gives districts data so that they can look at and evaluate and anticipate trends and use that information to inform their practice. The issue that I face as an educator and having worked through in K through 12 and then also in the university setting, is that how it's being used is the issue. And I want us to reevaluate that. It has been used as a critical marker for school performance in the way that it's tied to funding and it defines the future of our schools. And it's not quite fair or equitable. And it's also the type of funding, it's tied to poor schools, urban schools, schools that serve Black kids, and brown children, and it's not representative of the educational experience that they're getting. And so the idea around standardized testing is pretty interesting, and there's a lot of conversation around its place in education. In Philly and New York, there's an opt-out movement. Universities are moving away from making ACT and SAT testing required. They're going test optional. The most recent one is the University of Chicago. And that is pretty interesting. And many of the schools are citing that schoolwork, grade reports are better indicators of student success on campuses than are those standardized test scores. And so it's a great time to be having this conversation, and it certainly won't be the last time that we have the conversation.
And Chantelle, if I may jump in very quickly here.
Sure.
When you mentioned that a lot of this testing is driven by ESEA, now ESSA, and a lot of that's tied to Title I funds. And again, to your point, it is to make sure that we are educating all of our students, but that is a lot of these tests are testing programs are driven in majority, minority, and low income and rural type of education settings. But we also know, and colleges know this, is that for on the ACT and the SAT, it's actually parents' income that is determining a lot of what those test results look like. So it's just very interesting that a lot of the tests are being driven into lower income communities, but family income, family wealth is a major determining factor of whether or not you'll be able to do well on these tests to get into college anyways. So it's something that we need to be paying attention to figure out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for reiterating that. And I think when we look at the LEAP testing in particular, and as a person, I've worked in private school, and and I'm now a public school parent. We know that our children are not standardized, and we know that in particular for open enrollment schools, we're a different type of community. And those testing and the emphasis on the testing and the performance and tied to funding, again, there's no equity there because there are assumptions that are being made that just aren't adequate and it's not serving our children. And so the time that we're putting into LEAP testing takes away from its skills that our kids need to be successful in college and in life, just beyond college, beyond school in general. It doesn't measure our students' capacity for leadership and innovation. And that's huge in our community. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. And it also limits our students' ability to make choices for themselves. And the reason why I say that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, is because we don't give them enough time to explore. We are very focused on having structured time, have every single minute of a child's day accounted for. And there's no time to process, and there's no time to explore, and so the depth there of experience is missing. And that's what I wish for our children, is that they experience, again, an enriching educational experience where there's depth and exploration. So education research says the following are critical components to learning. Play, for example, for students of all ages, and now there's research that's saying even for adults, and I can attest to that.
Right, I was about to say.
Right in the middle of the day.
I agree.
Exactly. It's a necessary part of learning. And again, this isn't anything that's new and late breaking. This is research. The most recent research came from Harvard Grad School of Education in the spring, but it's nothing new. We've known this. Children make sense of the world through play. But in school, it seems a little counterintuitive because school is so structured, it's so focused, and play, it's not. Play it's loud, it can be messy, but there's so much learning that happens with students when they play. They process what they've learned, they negotiate, they collaborate. They test boundaries a little bit, and they form friendships and relationships that are really valuable. And when you let them play long enough, you will see that they pull in what they've learned from the classroom into their play. It's fascinating. We see it as a good example of this is when our children, my daughter will play school with her legions of stuffed animals and dolls. And she will have her audience, and she will act like a teacher, but she is actually teaching them what she learned that day. And it's amazing. And so it's just how they process things. And so Harvard, that little school that we might have known, we might have learned about Harvard, continues to validate this. Music and the arts. Music research by PBS, the folks who bought us Sesame Street, talks about how instrumental music is to brain development, how it stretches our brain muscles, and it trains us to think through things, complex concepts that has nothing to do with music. It trains our brain to do that. Arts education, validated by the Brookings Institute, says the same thing. The benefits are across the board, academic, social, and emotional, and just intervention for trauma, and as therapy. Arts education is incredibly valuable to us. Project-based learning, or learning by doing, is another critical component to education, where we will give students have the opportunity to basically build something, compose something, compile something based on what they've learned, and they make something that's tangible. And it gives so much depth and experience to a student's education. It's incredible. And again, project-based learning has been, John Dewey in the 1900s talked about how pivotal project-based learning is to students in their development of concepts. Another critical component to learning is diversity, the diversity of staff and faculty and school leadership. It's really important that students, that teachers and school leaders and board members reflect the communities they're serving. It's through the National Education Association, the NEA says this. The Learning Policy Institute, sponsored by Senator Cory Booker, backs the same thing. It's important to have people who look like our kids in the classroom and supported. Proper poverty and trauma intervention is another critical component to learning, especially for our open enrollment schools, especially for our urban schools, because we know poverty by itself is a trauma that alters brain development. And if there's not intervention, it has detrimental effects on students. Trauma works the same way. And there's also just emerging research that's saying just being Black in America is a form of trauma. And we have to be able to have responsive staff who are trained in responsive trauma intervention available, not just one single counselor who serves a whole school, but there should be a whole process to getting supports in place to make sure that our most vulnerable children are supported so that they can have rich educational experiences as well. The last critical component to learning is student and parent or school and parent collaboration. Some schools are not fans of having parents in the classroom or on campus, and they feel like we can do this, we can do this. But I like to think that schools and teachers are experts of children and learning. And I'd like to think that we as parents are experts on our children.
Right.
And so I can bring, as a parent, insight into why this isn't working for my child that maybe you haven't considered because you don't know that about my child. And not that I feel like parents should be in the classrooms all the time, but there's some really effective models that the NEA offers for schools to adopt and to consider so that we can have a really strong community where we're supporting not just our students, but we want to be able to support, I want to support my children's teachers. And so many of us want to know the proper ways to support each other.
Nice.
So yet, despite what we know in terms of education and research, our post-Katrina education reform efforts moved us, it seems, in the opposite direction. Even though testing emphasis has lessened since Hurricane Katrina, because I remember right after Katrina, there was everyone, it was like, you would wait for the test scores to come out and everyone was just so fixated on the testing. Even though the emphasis on testing has lessened slightly, it still exists and it's still tied to funding and to how schools operate in a way that I don't think is equitable. Also, I've noticed there's a decline in the access to play and just music and field trips and art. All of those critical components to learning have been whittled down for more instructional time. And it makes me really sad to know that. It makes me sad to know that my son comes home, he's a middle school boy and he's almost as tall as me. And he talks about like, well, we didn't have time for recess today. And it makes me sad because kids need to be physical and they need to explore in a multidimensional way. They need to explore their learning. Also, post-Katrina education reform, we've noticed that there is a serious absence of people of color in leadership roles in schools. And additionally, there's a lack of cultural competency by schools and boards. And we saw that with how students were disciplined. We saw that with how parents were treated. We saw it in how the expectations of, what was considered and passed off as classroom management. We saw how a disconnect, it was just so disconnected to what learning should be. But yet other schools didn't take that approach to learning. And it wasn't until our young people, and I was so proud of this, it wasn't until our young people mobilized, high school students, and mobilized and said, you know what, this isn't fair. I got kicked out because I wore different colored shoes and like whatever, or we were thrown out for this, or, it was wonderful to see young people advocating for themselves in that way. And it wasn't until they did that and there was news coverage that there was now all of a sudden conversations about, okay, well, maybe we don't need to go this far with how we approach students. But if we as parents were at the table at the beginning for education reform, this would not have happened. And so it's really unfortunate that it's taken this long and those missteps to bring us into a better place. I'm thankful for it, but we could have been farther along than this had there been more of a collaborative spirit to that. But
I'm sorry, but it just made me think of a couple of things you talked about, how there needs to be more cultural competency and active anti-racist training and ongoing conversations, because we have to look at what those approaches were telling us about what these folks thought about our children.
Yeah.
Right? Why there's so many different ways to structure a school, structure learning. why this approach? Why an
Mhm.
approach that seems to be aligned with punitive practices that you would see in a prison or jail system in our schools with our kids? Why is that the why was that the tone of the reform efforts that
Mhm.
were put in place? How
Mhm.
why do we think that giving our children an experience analogous to either the military or prison is what is going to help them be successful? So we have to question the assumptions and the attitudes that educators are and school leaders are coming into these spaces with.
Mhm.
And to your other point about diversity of faculty, I think I forgot the man's name who wrote it, but he just an article just recently came out. It was an opinion piece where he's like, stop asking me, the black educator
Yes.
in the in the school, to be the disciplinarian.
Yes.
Right? Why does the black man have to be the dean of
Mhm.
culture?
Right. Right. Right.
um, so those kinds of things. So yeah, just to like highlight some of those points that you made, that we need to be paying attention how all of the things that you're talking about are part of parents' experiences, and we really need to be asking a lot of questions about the assumptions that educators are making going into these spaces,
Mhm.
to when they're talking about reform. What
Mhm.
exactly is being reformed, who's being reformed, and what mechanisms are we using to quote
Mhm.
unquote change things or reform things. But back to you. Back to you.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, because it's so true. And it was just around that time that I moved back here from Los Angeles, and having spent the last 4 years or almost 5 years of my life being in a more progressive place and being in a wildly and unapologetically progressive school.
Mhm.
When I hear and I heard about education reform post Katrina, and I actually saw what it was, I was just like, oh, it just wasn't quite, it just reminded me of my Catholic school experience growing up, maybe, kind of thing. And so, again, it was a missed opportunity. And it wasn't because parents weren't voicing their concerns and their opinions. Their voices just weren't heard.
Mhm.
And so I want to move ahead in bringing this information to light, and just in alignment with you do every day. Like, let's help amplify our parents' voices based on stuff that we know is true, like this research and education. So rather than just harp on and focus on just the negatives or the missteps or what's not working, I do want to shift the conversation to more about highlighting just issues that could possibly offer us some solutions,
Mhm.
and so that we can learn about as parents, and even start to demand in our schools and in our communities. My next essential question is: can we imagine an education system that evaluates our strength and success of open enrollment schools in ways other than standardized testing? In my mind, I'm yelling, yes,
Yeah, right.
absolutely. And we can. And so I'm excited I have a list of just criteria that I want to propose, and to also let you know that it's by no means exhaustive. And like, I would love to see this list grow
Mhm.
just based on feedback from others. So let me just jump into it, and then I'm sure we'll continue the conversation even beyond this webinar. So one of the things that I propose is, again, having school leadership and faculty and staff that reflect our students who are enrolled, and at the very least undergo ongoing cultural competency training and ongoing anti-racist training.
Mhm.
um, you know our country was founded based on some principles that were not in our favor as people of color. In the 1600s, we were already written off and written into being lesser than. And since then, there have been lots of systems in place that reinforce that.
Mhm.
And because systems work the way that they do, we all contribute to systems that oppress, whether we know it or whether we don't know it. And so We need to, as educators, as people who are raising children, we need to do the work, the ongoing work of decolonizing our minds and undergoing anti-racist training. We all do. And for anyone, any school leader who says, oh, well, we did that. We did that 2 years ago. No, you need to do it. It needs to be a part of your professional development at the beginning of the year. It needs to happen in the middle of the year, and it has to happen at the end of the year, and it needs to be ongoing.
Right.
Because 2 hours of training, it doesn't solve anything. It is ongoing. It is a growth process. There's so much that's embedded in us that there's no way that we can untangle everything in 2 hours and think that we're okay with it.
Right.
And so I firmly believe, and this is probably one of the hills that I'd be willing to die on, like schools need to invest in this ongoing.
Right. Especially in our landscape where staff changes a lot.
Yes.
And so from year to year, you're having a different group of people informing what that school culture is going to look like. And so everybody needs to be on the same page and with regular check-ins as to how they're doing in terms of creating a school culture that is actively anti-racist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Our schools should be the hub of just anti-racist, like an anti-racist community. And that's what our goals should be. Another criterion is schools should emphasize the development of skills to thrive in the 21st century. Even before, and I hate to use the word the turn of the century because it makes us sound so old.
I know, right?
But on the turn of the century, we were having these conversations about the 21st century and the impact of technology so far. Technology has made us evolve so quickly in ways, and it has created so many opportunities that we're now in this century of not knowing what our future is going to look like in terms of professions, in terms of jobs, in terms of, just day-to-day living to some extent. But it wasn't like that. We lived in the Industrial Revolution, and we knew it was like factory work and line work, and that's what we knew. In an agrarian culture, if you're a farmer, your kids were going to be a farmer. Their kids were going to be a farmer. We don't know. And this is wonderful, and I don't mean to sound as if it's doom or gloom, but we have such an open-ended future that it's fascinating, but it leads the question, like, how do you educate children when you don't know exactly what you're educating them for in some ways?
Right.
And so these 21st century skills that are listed here really distill transferable skills that you're going to need regardless of what our society looks like 10 years, 20 years, 30, 40 years down the line. Learning skills like critical thinking skills. How can we teach our children to take big, weighty topics and break them down into smaller pieces to solve a problem? Creativity speaks for itself, and I'm glad it's on there just because creativity should be valued. Collaboration is on there, how we work with other people. And more than that, for our students, how do you learn to advocate for yourself? And how do you learn to advocate for yourself with your teacher? What if you don't understand something? You need the confidence, you need the ability to be able to go to your teacher and say, you know what, can you please repeat that? Or you said something today that really hurt my feelings, and I want to be able to work in this group, and I can't until we have this conversation. I've seen it happen, and it is powerful and it is beautiful. Communication works the same way. How we're articulating ourselves, much like collaboration, but also writing. And when I think about standardized testing, I don't know in my career as a student that I was ever timed in a way to write that wasn't trying to hone a specific skill.
Right.
Writing process, and I consider myself to be a writer. It is an ongoing process that you encounter. You write, you edit, you rewrite, you cry, you revisit,
Right.
you do all those things, and you go back and you make a final product. And even your final product, when you talk to writers and you ask them about a book that they wrote, they will still say that their book isn't finished.
Mm.
And so there is a level of infinity to writing that isn't necessarily captured in how we assess students. And we're taking away a beautiful process from them that will inspire growth. Literacy skills like information literacy, how you take information, how do you comprehend it and distill it, it will always be important, as will media literacy. How do you know what sources are legitimate sources versus what sources aren't? What's fake news and what's not, essentially, is what media literacy is.
Right.
Technology literacy is the same way. How are you able to adapt to different forms of technology in order to demonstrate your learning or in order to become a better learner? Life skills, and this part, it used to be called soft skills, but life skills are the game changer in society, and we know this as adults right now. Your ability to be flexible, leadership skills, the initiative you take, how productive you are, and how you're able to manage and maneuver social situations it can be the lever for you either getting a job or not getting a job, getting a promotion, getting a bank loan, getting backing for an innovative project that you have, being in the community and being a community leader. These are incredible skills that we should be focusing on in our classrooms every single day if we want to develop leaders and innovators and people who are ready for an open-ended future.
Especially that flexibility skill when you think about
Yes.
the context that we're living in. Our environmental context is going to have a lot of folks in New Orleans on the coast thinking about where to live.
Yes.
Migrating to other places and having to adapt to other cultures in other states, other cities, and being able to survive in different places. So you're going to have to be flexible, or just the world that we live in demands it. And if we're not cultivating that in children, we really are setting them up for hard times, if not failure.
Absolutely. And then just going back to Hurricane Katrina, I mean, the fact that we woke up one day living one place and then many of us uprooted and living somewhere completely different and out of our element.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest life lesson that we had to experience in Hurricane Katrina. And it's one of the things that I'm sure some folks, and I talk to people all the time, like they don't ever want to feel that out of place again. And so it's definitely worth instilling in our children in any way that we can. And unfortunately, again, schools can be the opposite of flexible. The schedules, the this, the that, and I understand it, but how can we build in flexibility and really uplift that skill as a value moving forward?
Yes.
So another part of my proposed criteria, like how do we evaluate any of this? It's hard. Part of what standardized testing does, it's a little easy. You have kids take a test,
Right.
score it, and you're like, ta-da, there we are.
Take out. Right.
Exactly. But what we're talking about is so malleable that it's not necessarily one particular way to evaluate, and it requires work and awareness. It really, really does on behalf of the teachers and the schools, but it's worth it. And so the way that I've seen it work really well, I mean, grade reports are great indicators of how students are doing. And especially those that come with narrative comments from their teachers. One of the reasons why University of Chicago is moving toward a testing optional admissions policy is because they said, you know what, the grade reports were better indicators of our student success. And that students who had higher grade point averages did better than students who scored higher on standardized testing. And it makes sense because it's a culmination of skills and experiences that you're constantly evaluating with grade reports. Another proponent or component that I propose is triangular conferences. And so it sounds very strange, but it's actually a version of parent-teacher conferences.
Mm-hmm.
So we all know, like, I'm going to a parent-teacher conference next week. Parent-teacher conferences, parents meet with the teacher, you talk about the student. And so it reinforces this context and this idea that education is done to students.
Right.
We're talking about students and they're not in the room. Triangular conferences invite students into the conversation so that they can be a part of the conversation and say, yes, I agree with what Ms. So-and-so is saying, or here's my interpretation of what happened here. This is what I know that I need to work on. Here are goals that I'm setting for myself. So all of a sudden, education, our students start to own their own educational experience, which is incredibly powerful. And it has to be done in age-appropriate ways. I mean, I propose second graders or first graders, depending, but second graders could be involved in a triangular conference at least for a few minutes so that they can be a part of it and know. And then as you get older, the more you as a student own that conversation.
Right.
Presentations of learning is similar to that. I've seen this work, and again, it is so powerful. It is for students. It gives students the opportunity to culminate, to pull together, and tell the story of their educational journey. And they'll touch on their core subjects, but they'll talk about the goals that they have set for themselves. And they'll talk about, something that great that happened when they really stretched themselves and they got out of their comfort zone. And then they'll talk about a time where they epically failed and what they learned from that. And so presentations of learning give students the opportunity to reflect deeply on who they've become as students and then plan for who they want to be as students. And the way that I've seen it done is fifth graders will do a smaller version of it, and maybe it's with their parents or family and the teachers. And then eighth graders, the audience gets a little bit bigger, but it's still people who love and support the student. And then by 12th grade, it's almost an auditorium full of people. But again, it's people who love and support you. And these are also people who said, oh, you know what, 2 weeks ago when you did your presentation of learning, your goals were this, and you're deviating from your goals. So you have a whole community of people who are now lovingly holding you accountable for what you said you wanted to do.
Right. And I can attest to the presentations of learning piece. We used to call them POLs. I worked at a school in Baltimore. This was almost 10 years ago at this point. And it was based on an expeditionary learning model. And so we did POLs and helped students prepare for them. And they were really powerful. Students took them very seriously. But to your point, they're not easy. This takes months of prep, weeks of prep, up to the last minute. They had to identify people to be on their panel in addition to their teachers. So parents, advocates, other people that they've identified, but students really had to take ownership of their own learning and their experiences. And we saw, this was a middle school, we saw middle school kids do amazing things in their well. So all for that.
Yes. And portfolios of work is another example of, and many schools do this, but I think this can be elevated because when you look at a student's work and you have samples of their writing, let's say from September, and you collect a piece of their writing from, in December, and then again in February, and then again at the end of the year, you can see exactly how a student has evolved as a writer. And oftentimes you can look at that portfolio work and understand whatever they're struggling with right now, you can see what the lever is to change that. Like, oh, here's where it is. You've been struggling with this since September or since December. Let's focus on this a little bit more. And then all of a sudden, they're like leaping ahead where they've been stuck and trying to figure out what to do. They can leap ahead because you've shown them a stretch of their work. And again, it honors the student. And so these are things, public speaking skills, pulling together your work. You have to have executive functioning skills where you're organizing your work and you're documenting things and your teacher's documenting things, and that you're planning for who's on your panel. You're planning for technology. You're doing all of these things. This is what you do in college. This is what you do in the real world.
Yes.
This is it. And if you wait until the last minute, you know what happens when you wait to the last minute. You're standing in front of 100 people and your slides are half done. And
Right.
so when you do that, you can't say that one of your stretches is that you're a planner, because you're not. You're showing that you're not. And so there's this wonderful way. Again, it's about accountability, and it's showing accountability in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So my rationale for this comes from the fact that, like, looking at standardized testing, looking at LEAP, that does not meet our children where they are. I have and just as a parent, a wonderfully articulate son. He was known, even in kindergarten, the head of school at the time would call him loquacious. But we knew what that meant. He was a chatterbox.
Right.
And he had a big vocabulary, and he still does. But if he takes a test, when he takes his ELA test, he struggles in that time setting. And so some of us as parents, we can see the growth, we can see our kids' enthusiasm for learning, and then all of a sudden we get that LEAP test back, and then, and I'm guilty of this too. I'm like, oh, I get deflated, because I'm like, well, something's not right. Like, what else is happening here? And so if we take a different approach to assessing our kids and deepening the educational experience, we meet them where they are, and they can grow and flourish in that way. We also shift the investment. Like, they want to be invested in their learning. If kids don't like to go to school, it's not because they're lazy. It's not because they don't want to learn. Kids love to learn. What they're saying is, it's not, you're not making, like, it's not worth my time.
Right. It's not engaging,
and so,
boring.
Yes. And so how do we make them invested in their educational experience? This approach also shifts the experience from producing followers, just people who are going to graduate and just not know what all they have the capacity for in our community, to producing leaders and innovators. And don't we need leaders and innovators? If we're thinking of an undefined future, we need leaders and innovators. And we know that cultural icons like, Jobs and, like Gates and, even to like Jay-Z, like, these were folks who did not do well in school. And yet they sit and they are in the history books for being innovative, for being creative, for being successful. I mean, they're incredibly wealthy people, but they've made a mark on this society despite education, right? Despite their educational experiences. So what happens if we shift the education experience to produce leaders and innovators, as private schools do? This also makes space for parents to be integral supporters of both students and of teachers, and recognizing that this proposed approach, it adds so much more work on teachers in so many ways, and they should be trained, supported, and paid accordingly. And I should have put that as a slide bullet, but they should, because it takes personal investment in authentic relationships, and this commitment to really helping each student, meeting each student where they are. And then again, it positions our students for success in life beyond school. So whether they are going to college, whether they're going to start a business, whether they're going to go to a trade school, they have the skills, they have the mental agility, they have the confidence to ask questions so that they can navigate through life successfully, and that they could be contributing members of our community. And so I want to wrap up here, technically, but also invite ongoing dialogue about this, because as I mentioned, my list of criteria is not exhaustive, and I want feedback. I want to hear from parents. I want to hear from teachers to know what are other things that we should be considering to have an enriching school experience for our kids.
Right.
So I have lots of ways that you can contact me on here. Email at chantelle@hhp-llc.com. I'm on LinkedIn. You can just put in Chantelle Pierre and I'll pop right up. I'm on Instagram at Chantelle HHP, and I'm also on Facebook at Chantelle Pierre. So please reach out, please connect. Let's continue to have this conversation. And I'm incredibly honored to be a part of the presenters for this week. And thank you for having me, Nahliah. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much,
You're
Chantelle. This
welcome.
was amazing.
Thank you.
This is a conversation that people are kind of sort of having, but not really. So I appreciate you bringing all of these ideas together. And this is, supportive of what parents are doing, but it's also supportive of what teachers are doing. We
Yes.
are often concerned about parents being able to advocate, but also teachers also need support in their own advocacy. They're often not treated like the professionals that they
I
are
agree.
and are, for all this talk about, reform and schools having autonomy. I talk to teachers all the time and they don't have necessarily the autonomy in their classrooms to structure their academic plans the way that they would want to, and to be able to and provide the deep, rich learning experiences that you're talking about to kids. So I hope that this is an opportunity for parents and teachers and also other educators and administrators who want to be pushing more of this, who want to kind of push back on the over testing that we're doing with our young people. So hopefully this is a tool that they can use to press those concerns and see those changes. Because, our kids are not just taking the LEAP test, they're taking benchmarks.
They are, yes.
Math testing, and that could be anywhere on an every 6 to 12 week cycle.
Yep. You're right. You're absolutely right.
So there's a lot of testing that happens before the LEAP test. And maybe we can start thinking about what are some things that we can swap some of that out of, or at least add to it, so that children, students, and parents and teachers can have a better and more holistic understanding of what's happening with our young learners. So thank you very much for this. We are going to help as much as we can to get people connected to you to continue these conversations, because if this was going to be, the city for reform, then these are what it should have looked like for our kids and our families and our schools. So thank you very much, Chantelle.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to have you do this, and we look forward to what's to come with this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're going to sign out, but this will be available and we're going to stay in touch. So thank you again.
Yay, thanks. Bye-bye.